They say that family is a tree with many branches, but no one ever warns you about how heavy those branches get when you are the only one watering the roots. My name is Sarah. I am 42 years old. For the past 10 years, I have been the invisible glue holding my family together. On a warm Saturday afternoon late in the summer, I was standing in my small kitchen. I was staring at a massive bowl of potato salad. Today was my parents' 40th anniversary. I was hosting the backyard barbecue at my house. I was paying for the catering. I was running myself ragged trying to make everything perfect. The air outside was thick and humid. The heat inside the kitchen, however, was much worse. My feet ached from standing since 6 in the morning. Suddenly, the screen door slammed shut. My younger sister Emily walked in. She was 36, perfectly tanned, and holding absolutely nothing. Her husband Mark trailed right behind her. He was adjusting his expensive sunglasses. He was 38, dressed like he was heading to a golf course, and equally empty-handed. "Happy anniversary day," Emily chirped, leaning over the counter. She casually plucked a strawberry from the fruit platter. I smiled, wiping my hands on my damp apron. "You are late," I said softly. "The guests will be here in exactly 20 minutes. Mark laughed, a booming sound that always felt a little too loud for my quiet house. "Relax, Sarah," he said, leaning his heavy frame against my refrigerator. "It is just a barbecue, not a state dinner." I swallowed the hard knot of frustration in my throat. I had spent $800 on the food alone. I had spent 3 entire days cleaning the yard, stringing fairy lights, and setting up the rented tables. It was incredibly easy to tell someone to relax when you did none of the actual work. Emily reached into her designer bag and pulled out a folded piece of thick paper. "I made the seating chart for the formal toast," she announced, smoothing it out on the counter. "Mom wanted everything to look elegant, so I took care of it." "Thank you," I said, feeling genuinely surprised. I was glad she had contributed something to the party. I leaned over to look closely at the chart. My eyes quickly scanned the beautifully written names. My parents were seated at the head of the main table. Emily and Mark were seated right next to them, right in the center of the action. I kept reading, looking for my own name. I finally found it at the very bottom of the page. I was placed at the secondary table near the back fence. I was assigned to sit with Emily and Mark and their 3 young children. I looked up, staring directly at my sister. "Emily," I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper, "why am I sitting at the kids' table?" Emily sighed, rolling her eyes just a fraction. "Oh, Sarah, please do not make a big deal out of this," she said. "Someone has to make sure the kids do not spill juice all over the expensive rented linens. You are so good with them, and Mark and I really need to mingle with Mom and Dad and their country club friends. It just makes sense. It makes sense." The words echoed loudly in my ears. It made perfect sense for the host to sit as far away as possible. It made perfect sense for the woman who paid for the entire event to be treated like a hired babysitter. "Are you sure about this?" I asked, giving her one last chance to realize how hurtful her plan was. Mark stepped in, crossing his arms tightly over his polo shirt. "Come on, Sarah, be a team player," he said, his tone dripping with absolute condescension. "You are single. You do not have kids of your own, so you are the logical choice to watch ours. Plus, it is not like you have a husband to sit with at the main table anyway." The kitchen went completely silent. The low hum of the refrigerator suddenly sounded deafening. I looked at Mark. I looked at Emily. She was busy checking her reflection in the microwave door, completely unbothered by her husband and his cruel remark. They did not see a sister or a host or a loving daughter. They saw pure utility. They saw someone who was supposed to serve them quietly and without a single complaint. I felt a hot, sharp pain in my chest. It was a pain that I had been carrying for a very long decade. Mark chuckled, breaking the heavy silence. He looked around my small kitchen and then peered down the narrow hallway. You know, Sarah, if you worked a little harder, maybe you could afford a bigger place, he said casually. Maybe a house in a better neighborhood where you could actually join a country club like us. I stared at him, feeling the absolute weight of his ignorance. My house was small, yes, but it was small because I spent half of my income keeping his in-laws in their massive, sprawling estate. I worked as a freelance bookkeeper. I worked 60 hours a week. I worked from a tiny desk crammed into the corner of my guest bedroom. I did not yell. I did not throw the potato salad at his smug face. I just took a very slow, deep breath. Okay, Mark, I said quietly. I will keep an eye on the kids tonight. Emily clapped her hands together, looking absolutely thrilled. Oh, thank you, Sarah, she squealed. You are an absolute lifesaver. I turned away from them and walked down the short hallway. I need to check on the extra folding chairs, I lied. I stepped into my tiny office and gently pushed the door closed. The room was quiet. The walls were painted a soft, soothing blue. My desk was buried under endless stacks of paper. I walked over to my chair and sat down heavily. I pulled open the top drawer of my metal filing cabinet. Inside, neatly organized in manila folders, was the hidden truth of our family. I pulled out the thick folder labeled with my parents' names. I flipped through the pages. There were the paid receipts for their property taxes. There were the monthly statements for their premium cable television package. There were the massive medical bills that I had quietly covered last winter. I reached deeper into the drawer and pulled out a smaller red folder. It belonged to Emily. Inside was the printed statement for the emergency credit card that I kept in her name. I opened it and ran my finger down the long list of charges. $300 at a high-end hair salon, $200 at a luxury baby boutique, $50 for gourmet coffee. These were not emergencies. These were lavish lifestyle choices. They were choices funded entirely by my silent exhaustion. I looked at my own hands. My knuckles were dry and red. My nails were short and completely unpolished. I had not bought myself a new piece of clothing in over a full year. I turned my head and looked out the small window of my office. The backyard was filling up with people. I saw my parents arrive, stepping out of their luxury sedan. My mother was wearing a beautiful silk dress. She waved to her friends, laughing loudly. She did not walk into the kitchen to say hello to me. She walked straight to the patio, ready to be celebrated. For 10 long years, I believed that my value was tied directly to my usefulness. I thought if I paid enough bills, they would finally see me. I thought if I solved all their problems, they would eventually love me just for being Sarah. But sitting there watching them through the glass, a cold, clear realization washed over me. They did not love me. They loved my money. They loved my quiet, endless sacrifice. I was a human bank account wrapped in a catering apron. I looked down at the stack of bills. I looked at the credit card statement. A strange, unfamiliar feeling began to bloom in my chest. It was not anger. Anger requires energy, and I had absolutely none left to give. It was an absolute, terrifying sense of peace. I opened my laptop. The screen glowed, illuminating the dark corners of the room. I logged into my primary banking portal. The secure interface loaded, displaying my carefully managed accounts. I navigated to the automated transfers section. There it was, the monthly scheduled payment for my parents' mortgage. I hovered my cursor over the screen. I clicked the small gray button that said cancel. A warning box popped up on the screen asking me to confirm. I took a breath and clicked yes. I moved down the list. The automatic transfer for the country club dues. Canceled. The recurring payment for the luxury car lease. Canceled. The direct deposit to Emily for the children and their private sports leagues. Canceled. Finally, I clicked on the credit card management tab. I selected the emergency card, the one currently resting in my sister and her expensive designer purse. I clicked the option to freeze the account. The system processed the request and a bright green checkmark appeared. It took less than 5 minutes. In 5 minutes, I completely dismantled the financial fortress that I had spent a decade building for them. I closed the laptop. The screen went black, plunging the room back into shadows. I sat in the dark for a long moment, listening to the gentle hum of my air conditioner. The fear was there, lingering at the edges of my mind, but it was entirely overshadowed by a profound, sudden lightness. I did not need to scream or cry or demand an apology. I just needed to step back and let the system break down. I stood up and smoothed down my apron. I walked back out to the kitchen, a calm, genuine smile resting comfortably on my face. I was going to serve them dinner. I was going to sit at the back table. I was going to watch my nieces and nephews. I was going to be the perfect invisible host for one last night. Because starting tomorrow morning, the free ride was officially over. Starting tomorrow, they were going to have to learn how to survive in the real world. And the real world was incredibly expensive. Monday morning arrived wrapped in a soft, unfamiliar silence. The sun crept through the blinds of my bedroom window, casting long, golden shadows across the floor. Usually, by 6 in the morning, my phone would be vibrating right off the nightstand. My old routine was a frantic, exhausting race. I would wake up and immediately send a text message to my mother reminding her to take her morning blood pressure medication. Then I would message Emily to remind her about the twins and their upcoming dental appointments. I was their human alarm clock, their personal assistant, and their living calendar. Today, I left the phone resting on the wood. I did not touch it. I slowly threw off the covers and walked into the kitchen. I poured filtered water into my coffee maker, listening to the gentle bubbling sound. I made myself a large cup of dark roast, and I poured a splash of heavy cream into the mug. I walked over to the small round kitchen table. I sat down and I simply watched the steam rise into the cool air. The house was entirely quiet. By 8 o'clock, I was sitting at my desk organizing a spreadsheet for a new corporate client. The frantic buzzing finally began. The screen of my phone lit up, flashing my sister and her name. I let it ring. I watched it vibrate across the desk until it finally stopped. A minute later, a text message appeared on the screen. It was short and incredibly demanding. I overslept, the message read. "Why did you not call me to make sure I was up? The kids missed the school bus. I need you to come drive them to school right now." I stared at the glowing letters. A week ago, I would have dropped my client files, grabbed my car keys, and rushed across town to save her from her own irresponsibility. I would have driven the children to school, apologizing to the teachers, while Emily went back to sleep in her massive bed. I placed my fingers on the keyboard. "I am working," I typed back slowly. "You will have to drive them yourself. Have a good morning." I hit send and I placed the phone face down on the very edge of the desk. My heart fluttered, beating a rapid, nervous rhythm against my ribs. It felt incredibly strange to say no. It felt unnatural to refuse a simple request for help. But I forced myself to look at my computer screen. I focused on the numbers and the columns and the rows of data. 2 hours later, my father called. He did not say hello when I finally answered the phone. He launched straight into a loud, irritable complaint. "Sarah," he barked, his voice echoing in my small office. "I am standing at the golf course and the pro shop is telling me I do not have a tea time. You were supposed to call them on Friday and confirm my regular slot. What is going on? I leaned back in my office chair. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the oxygen fill my lungs. I am sorry, Dad, I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. I did not have time to manage your golf schedule this week. I was busy paying for and preparing for the anniversary party. You will have to call them yourself from now on. There was a long, heavy pause on the other end of the line. I could hear the wind blowing across the golf course and the sound of someone hitting a golf ball in the distance. He was genuinely shocked. What do you mean you did not have time? He asked, sounding completely bewildered. It takes 5 minutes, Sarah. Now I am standing here looking like an absolute fool in front of the club manager. I am working, Dad, I repeated softly. I have to go. Goodbye. I hung up the phone before he could say another word. I rested my forehead against the cool heels of my hands. The guilt tried to creep in, wrapping its cold, familiar fingers around my chest. They were struggling because I had suddenly dropped the heavy ropes that held their comfortable lives up. But I reminded myself that they were perfectly capable, healthy adults. They knew how to set alarm clocks. They knew how to make phone calls. They had just forgotten how, because I had made it entirely too easy for them to forget. The daily routine was unraveling thread by tiny thread. The fragile house of cards was beginning to sway in the breeze. I felt a sharp, unexpected pang of loneliness mixed directly with the strange new peace. The silence in my house was beautiful, but it was also a stark reminder of how empty my life was outside of serving them. I realized I needed to talk to someone who actually saw me as a person, and not just a convenient invisible tool. The bells on the door of the small corner cafe jingled softly as I pushed it open. The smell of roasted espresso beans and warm vanilla washed over me. It was Tuesday afternoon. I saw Clara sitting in a quiet booth near the back window. She was holding a large ceramic mug. Clara was my oldest friend. We had met in college almost 20 years ago. She was a high school counselor with kind eyes and a habit of listening to what people did not say. I walked over and slid into the vinyl booth across from her. I felt a deep, heavy exhaustion settling into my bones. I ordered a hot chamomile tea. Clara looked at me, tilting her head slightly. "You look different today, Sarah," she said softly. "You look like you finally put down a very heavy bag." I wrapped my hands around the warm teacup. "I stopped paying," I whispered, staring down at the amber liquid. Clara slowly placed her coffee mug on the wooden table. She leaned forward, resting her arms on the table. "You stopped paying for what exactly?" she asked. Everything I said, feeling a sudden rush of tears stinging the corners of my eyes. The mortgage on the big house, the luxury car payments, the country club dues, the private sports leagues for the kids. I logged into the bank and I canceled every single automatic transfer. I froze the emergency credit card. "I am completely done, Clara." Clara let out a long, slow breath. She reached across the table and gently placed her hand over mine. "Oh, honey," she murmured. "How long have you been carrying all of that?" 10 years, I replied, my voice shaking slightly. I took a sip of my tea, trying to swallow the lump in my throat. It started small. Dad had a bad quarter at his firm and they needed help with the property taxes. I had just landed my first big corporate client, so I wrote the check. They were so grateful. Mom hugged me and called me her lifesaver. I felt so important, Clara. I felt like they finally saw me. Clara nodded slowly, squeezing my hand. "Because you were always the quiet one," she said gently. "The one who never demanded attention while Emily took up all the oxygen in the room." I smiled a sad, broken smile. "Exactly," I said. "I thought if I just made their lives easier, they would love me more." Emily wanted a massive wedding, so I paid for the flowers and the catering. Mark lost his job, so I gave him a silent loan to start his new business. He never paid me back a single dime. Mom wanted to keep up appearances with her wealthy friends, so I took over the mortgage pretending it was a smart real estate investment. I worked until midnight every single night just to keep their beautiful illusion alive. "And what did you get in return?" Clara asked, her eyes filled with deep empathy. I looked out the cafe window watching the cars drive past in the afternoon sun. "I got an invitation to sit at the kids' table," I said quietly. "I got mocked for living in a small house by the man whose life I was literally funding. I realized they do not love me. They love the convenience I provide. I was buying their affection on an installment plan, and the interest rate finally bankrupted my soul." Clara did not offer empty platitudes. She did not tell me it was going to be okay. She just sat there holding space for my grief. "Setting a boundary is not cruel, Sarah," Clara said softly. "You did not abandon them. You just stopped abandoning yourself. It is time for them to stand on their own 2 feet. I nodded, wiping a stray tear from my cheek. I knew she was right, but I also knew the storm was just beginning. They had not realized the money was gone yet. The grace period for the bills was ticking away second by second. Soon the letters would start arriving in their mailboxes. The credit cards would bounce. The reality of their unchecked spending would hit them like a freight train. I finished my tea feeling a renewed sense of strength. I walked out of the coffee shop, stepping back into the warm summer air. I was terrified of the conflict that was coming, but for the first time in a decade, my bank account and my conscience belonged entirely to me. Wednesday morning arrived, bringing the first real wave of the storm. I was sitting at my kitchen island reviewing a tax document for a corporate client. The morning sunlight was pouring through the window, warming the polished wooden counter. My phone resting near my coffee mug suddenly began to ring. The screen flashed brightly, showing my sister and her smiling contact photo. I stared at the glowing device for a long moment. I knew exactly why she was calling. I reached out and picked up the phone. "Hello?" I said, keeping my voice low and steady. "Sarah!" Thank goodness, Emily practically shouted into the receiver. She sounded breathless and highly annoyed. "Listen, I am standing at the registration desk for the Elite Youth Soccer League. The registration closes in exactly 20 minutes, and my card just declined." I closed my eyes, letting out a slow, quiet breath. I held the phone slightly away from my ear as she continued to complain rapidly. "It was so embarrassing." Emily huffed, her voice echoing with deep indignation. The receptionist, the young one with the terrible highlight job, just looked at me like I was completely broke. "I know you said you were working today, but you need to call your bank right now. Tell them to lift the fraud alert on the emergency card. They must have blocked it by mistake because the registration fee is $800. She did not ask how I was doing. She did not apologize for her rude behavior at the backyard barbecue. She just demanded the money, fully expecting me to fix her problem in a matter of seconds. I pictured her standing in the upscale lobby, tapping her expensive leather shoes, waiting for her invisible safety net to catch her. "Emily," I said carefully, choosing my words, "there is no fraud alert on the card." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. I heard the busy background noise of parents chatting and children running down a long hallway. "What do you mean there is no fraud alert?" Emily asked, her tone shifting from annoyed to slightly confused. The machine beeped very loudly and said insufficient funds. "Just transfer the money from your savings account so I can run it again. The kids really need their new uniforms by Friday." I gripped the edge of the wooden counter. My knuckles turned white under the intense pressure. "I cannot do that, Emily," I said softly. "What do you mean you cannot do that?" she snapped. The confusion was completely gone. replaced instantly by sharp, familiar anger. "Sarah, stop playing around. I have 3 mothers standing right behind me in line, and they are staring at me. Just move the money right now." I felt a familiar, terrible urge to just give in. It would be so incredibly easy to open my banking application and hit a few buttons. It would end the immediate conflict before it escalated. I would not have to hear her yell or deal with the fallout. But then I remembered Mark standing smugly in my kitchen. I remembered his cruel joke about my small house and my lack of a country club membership. I remembered the carefully written seating chart placing me at the kids' table. "I am not playing around, Emily," I said, my voice shaking just a little bit. "I canceled the automatic transfers. I froze the emergency credit card. I am not paying the registration fee for the elite soccer league. I am not paying for the expensive hair salons or the boutique baby clothes anymore." The absolute silence that followed was incredibly thick. It felt heavy, pressing down through the phone line. I could almost hear the gears turning in her mind, trying desperately to process a harsh reality that she had never faced before. "Are you insane?" Emily finally hissed, lowering her voice to a furious, venomous whisper. "You are punishing my innocent children because you are in a bad mood. You are being completely selfish, Sarah. Mark is in the middle of a huge business deal, and our cash is temporarily tied up in investments. You know we rely on that card for the extra expenses. They were not extra expenses. They were lavish luxuries funded entirely by my sweat and my daily exhaustion. You and Mark make a combined income that is twice as large as mine," I replied, fighting the hot tears that threatened to fall. "If the soccer league is truly important to you, you will have to find a way to budget for it yourselves. The emergency card is permanently closed. Sarah, if you do not transfer that money right this second, I will never forgive you," she threatened, her voice shaking with pure, unadulterated rage. "You are humiliating me on purpose." "I am sorry you feel humiliated," I said, finding a deep well of courage that I did not know I possessed. "But my bank account is officially closed for business. I have to get back to my work now." I did not wait for her to scream again. I pulled the phone away from my ear and firmly pressed the red button to end the call. My hand was trembling so violently, I nearly dropped the phone onto the kitchen floor. I placed it gently on the counter, and I buried my face in my hands. I took deep, shuddering breaths, trying to calm my racing, anxious heart. I had actually done it. I had said no to the untouchable golden child. I had cut the very first string of the massive financial puppet show. The guilt was heavy, pulling at my stomach, but the absolute freedom was intoxicating. I knew Emily was currently storming out of the sports club. I knew she was furiously dialing her husband, ready to unleash a torrent of complaints about her terrible, selfish sister. I knew the family group chat was about to explode with righteous outrage. But as I sat there listening to the quiet, steady hum of my refrigerator, I realized something incredibly important. I was not responsible for her public embarrassment. I was not responsible for her complete lack of financial planning. For the first time in my entire adult life, I was only responsible for myself. Thursday afternoon brought a heavy gray rainstorm. I was sitting on my covered back porch reading a novel. It was a rare luxury that I had not afforded myself in many years. Usually, I spent my rainy afternoons balancing complicated spreadsheets or running tedious errands for my mother. Today, I was just listening to the heavy rain hitting the wooden deck. My phone buzzed loudly, sliding across the wet glass of the patio table. The bright screen showed my mother calling. I let out a slow, steady sigh and answered the call. "Sarah," my mother said, her voice dripping with sharp, unmistakable irritation. "I just opened the afternoon mail, and there is a bright pink envelope from the electric company." I turned the page of my book, not really reading the printed words. "Oh," I said, simply waiting for her to continue. "It says we are past due," my mother complained, her tone rapidly escalating into a harsh reprimand. "It says they are going to disconnect the power on Tuesday morning. Sarah, how could you be so incredibly careless? You are supposed to handle these things. I have ladies coming over for a bridge game on Wednesday afternoon. I cannot have a dark, uncomfortable house." "Mom," I said, setting my book down heavily on my lap. I did not forget to pay it. I canceled the automatic draft from my personal checking account. "I told Dad on Monday that I was no longer managing your finances." There was a sharp, dramatic gasp on the other end of the line. "You told him you did not have time to make a golf reservation," my mother corrected, sounding highly offended. "You did not say you were going to let us live like pioneers in the dark." "Sarah, what is wrong with you lately? Are you depressed? Is this all about the seating chart from the anniversary party?" "It is not about the seating chart, Mom," I replied gently, but keeping my voice entirely firm. "It is about the fact that I am 42 years old, and I have been paying your massive utility bills for 5 long years. You and Dad receive a very generous monthly pension. You can easily afford your own electricity, but you are the professional bookkeeper," she argued, her defensiveness rising up like a massive tidal wave. "You are good with numbers. Your father and we get so confused by all these complicated online portals. You are just being malicious because Emily got a little upset with you yesterday. She called me crying and told me how awful you were to her at the soccer club." I closed my eyes, listening to the thunder roll in the far distance. The family gossip train was already running at full speed. They were spinning a story to make themselves the victims. "I was not awful to Emily," I said slowly, emphasizing the frequent pauses for my own sanity. "I just stopped paying for her expensive luxuries. And I am stopping for you and Dad too. You need to call the electric company today and give them your own checking account number." "I will do no such thing," my mother huffed, sounding deeply insulted by the very suggestion of responsibility. "You need to fix this mess, Sarah. This is completely unacceptable behavior for a loving daughter. You are tearing this family apart over a few silly dollars." "It is not a few dollars, Mom," I said, feeling the familiar heavy exhaustion creeping right back into my tired bones. "It is hundreds of thousands of dollars over the last 10 years. I love you, but I am completely done. You have until Tuesday to pay the bill." I hung up the phone gently, placing it back on the glass patio table. The rain continued to fall in thick sheets, washing the summer dust off the patio furniture. An hour later, my computer pinged with an incoming email notification. I walked inside the house and opened my laptop. It was an email from my father. He had forwarded a digital invoice for his premium sports cable television package. The subject line simply read, "Please handle this immediately." I stared at the glowing screen. He was completely ignoring the boundary. He was actively testing the waters, assuming my mother was exaggerating the situation or assuming I would easily cave under his direct instruction. I clicked the reply button. I typed a very short, highly polite response. "Dad, as I mentioned to Mom on the phone, I am no longer managing or funding your monthly household expenses. Please update the billing information with your own credit card." I sent the email and immediately archived the entire thread. The small house felt very different now. It was no longer just a quiet, safe sanctuary. It felt like a small, isolated fortress under a heavy siege. The shifting dynamic was causing intense friction. The people who claimed to love me were incredibly angry simply because they could no longer use my bank account. They were confused and they were heavily defensive. They preferred to believe that I was simply having a petty, irrational tantrum. They absolutely refused to see the massive sacrifices I had made to keep them completely comfortable for a decade. Friday evening arrived, bringing a cool, gentle breeze through my open windows. I was sitting on my living room sofa watching a quiet nature documentary. I had successfully ignored 3 calls from my mother and 2 text messages from my sister earlier in the afternoon. I felt a strange new strength settling deeply into my chest. But the peaceful silence was briefly shattered when my phone vibrated violently against the wooden coffee table. The bright screen illuminated, showing Mark and his name flashing in large letters. I felt a sudden sharp spike of anxiety in the pit of my stomach. I did not reach out to pick up the phone. I sat perfectly still, watching the screen flash over and over again in the dim light of the living room. Finally, the glowing screen went dark. A moment later, a small notification appeared indicating a new unheard voicemail message. I picked up the device, my hands trembling slightly despite my newfound resolve. I pressed the play button and I placed the phone back down on the table. Mark and his loud, highly aggressive voice instantly filled the quiet room.
"Sarah, it is Mark,"
he began, his tone dripping with heavy masculine condescension.
"I am calling you tonight because Emily has been crying for 3 solid days. I hope you are incredibly proud of your little temper tantrum. You completely ruined her entire week, and you intentionally humiliated her in front of the entire soccer league registration desk." I closed my eyes, listening to him confidently rewrite history to perfectly suit his own narrative. "I do not know what your problem is lately,"
Mark continued, his voice growing louder and much more hostile with every word.
"Emily said you are acting completely selfish because you are deeply jealous of our lifestyle.
You know perfectly well I have a massive amount of capital currently tied up in commercial real estate investments. We are temporarily cash poor this month because we are actively building wealth for the future. We relied heavily on that emergency card as a temporary bridge. You cutting it off without giving us any warning is incredibly immature and frankly very unprofessional." I let out a harsh, bitter laugh in the empty room.
"Unprofessional."
He was treating my personal hard-earned bank account exactly like a corporate line of credit. He was using sophisticated business buzzwords to completely mask his absolute lack of financial stability. "You need to call Emily and apologize to her immediately," Mark demanded, his voice echoing loudly in my small living room. "And you need to call the bank and turn the emergency card back on before the weekend. Family helps family, Sarah. If you ever want to sit at the big table with us, you have to act like a supportive, generous sister instead of a bitter, isolated spinster. Fix this mess before you permanently ruin your relationship with us." The voicemail ended with a sharp, abrupt click. I sat in the heavy silence, letting his cruel, heavily projected insults wash completely over me. A bitter, isolated spinster. The harsh words definitely stung, but they did not hurt as much as they used to. Because I knew the absolute, undeniable truth. I knew his massive commercial real estate investments did not actually exist. 5 years ago, Mark came to this very small house begging for a desperate loan. He had completely maxed out his personal credit cards. He had secretly drained their joint checking account to fully fund a completely failed business venture. He sat on this exact sofa, and he cried genuine tears, pleading with me to save his family from public bankruptcy. I gave him $30,000. I wiped out my entire life savings to strictly protect my sister and her young children from complete financial ruin. He looked me in the eye and he promised to pay me back within 6 short months. He never gave me a single solitary dime in return. Instead of repaying his massive debt, he leased a brand new luxury car and he bought highly expensive golf clubs. He carefully built an elaborate, totally false narrative portraying himself to the world as a highly successful entrepreneur. and he fully expected me to silently fund the beautiful illusion forever. He was projecting his own deep, terrifying insecurities entirely onto me. He called me completely selfish because he was absolutely terrified that his fragile house of cards was finally collapsing around him. He blamed me for ruining Emily and her week because he could not actually provide the lavish lifestyle he had promised to give her. He was shifting the heavy blame because facing his own massive failures was too painful for his fragile ego. I reached out for my phone, feeling a cold, crystalline clarity quickly replacing the lingering anxiety. I did not delete the hostile voicemail. I deliberately saved it specifically to remind myself exactly who I was dealing with when my resolve felt weak. I was not playing a petty, childish game. I was carefully extracting myself from a highly toxic, entirely parasitic relationship. The great blame game was currently in full swing, but I absolutely refused to walk onto the playing field. I turned off the volume on my phone, placing it face down. I picked up my remote control and I started my quiet documentary again. I was not going to call Emily. I was not going to offer a fake apology. I was not going to fix his massive financial mess. I was simply going to sit on my comfortable sofa and let him face the absolute crushing weight of his own terrible reality. 4 weeks passed in a slow, incredibly quiet blur. The frantic phone calls and the angry text messages completely stopped. My family decided to employ a completely new tactic. They decided to freeze me out entirely. It was a calculated, highly deliberate silence. I saw the vibrant pictures posted on their public social media accounts. Emily posted a beautiful, sunny photo of a large family dinner at a very expensive seafood restaurant. My parents were smiling brightly, holding large glasses of white wine. The caption read, "Nothing matters more than family." I was intentionally excluded from the dinner and the digital performance. I heard the swirling rumors through the small suburban grapevine. Clara, my loyal friend, gently relayed the toxic gossip to me over our weekly coffee dates. My mother told her afternoon bridge club that I was simply going through a bitter, highly erratic phase. She claimed I was pushing everyone away because I was deeply unhappy with my own lonely life. Emily told her wealthy friends that I was having a severe midlife crisis and completely refusing to participate in normal family activities. They carefully spun a comfortable, completely fictional web specifically to protect their own fragile reputations. They needed a villain to explain the sudden lack of luxury, and they gladly assigned the role to me. It hurt more than I ever expected it to hurt. The absolute deafening silence was incredibly heavy at first. I would wake up on a bright Saturday morning and instinctively reach for my phone, fully expecting a highly demanding message. When the glowing screen remained completely dark, a sharp, deep pang of rejection would hit the center of my chest. They did not miss my company or my laugh or my advice. They only missed my open checkbook. The harsh realization was a bitter pill that I had to swallow every single day. But as the long days turned into short weeks, the heavy sting began to fade. It was slowly replaced by a profound, incredibly unfamiliar sense of deep rest. I started sleeping soundly through the entire night for the very first time in 10 years. I was no longer waking up in a cold sweat, desperately trying to remember if I had paid my parents' expensive property taxes. The persistent heavy knot of anxiety in my stomach slowly began to unravel. My shoulders, which had been permanently hitched up to my ears, finally dropped. I started to rediscover the simple joys of my own life. I started cooking elaborate, highly nutritious meals just for myself instead of eating cold leftovers over the kitchen sink. I took long, slow walks through my quiet neighborhood without my phone buzzing constantly in my pocket. I bought new incredibly soft sheets for my bed, specifically using the extra money I had saved from closing the emergency credit card. The small house which Mark had mocked so cruelly at the anniversary barbecue started to feel completely different. It no longer felt like a cramped, stressful office. It felt like a beautiful, warm sanctuary. I spent my quiet evenings reading thick novels and listening to classical music. I was completely alone, but I was absolutely not lonely. I was finally keeping company with myself. I knew deep down that the silent treatment was not a permanent surrender. It was merely a strategic retreat. They were waiting patiently for me to crack under the heavy, crushing weight of the isolation. They fully expected me to come crawling back with a heartfelt apology, begging desperately for their highly conditional love. They thought the absolute silence would be my ultimate punishment. They did not realize that the growing distance was the greatest gift they could have ever given me. It gave me the precious time to heal my exhausted mind. But the quiet weeks were rapidly coming to an end. The calendar was turning toward a mandatory family gathering, and the fragile, beautiful peace I had built was about to be severely tested. The first Sunday of November brought a sharp, biting chill to the air. It was the day of our mandatory monthly family dinner. For the past 10 years, the first Sunday of every single month followed an incredibly strict, highly exhausting script. I would wake up at the absolute crack of dawn when the sky was still dark and drive to the expensive specialty grocery store across town. I would easily spend over $200 of my own hard-earned money carefully selecting organic vegetables, prime cuts of meat, and imported cheeses. I would arrive at my parents' sprawling house exactly at noon. I would strap on a heavy canvas apron and spend 5 long hours sweating over their hot stove. I would scrub their countertops, set their large, formal dining table with the good china, and polish their expensive silver until it shined perfectly. My mother would usually spend the entire afternoon upstairs in her massive bedroom, taking a nap and getting dressed. My father would sit comfortably in his leather recliner, watching professional football loudly on the television, completely ignoring the chaotic mess in the kitchen. Emily and Mark would inevitably arrive 45 minutes late, completely empty-handed, and complain loudly about how hungry they were. I would serve them, clear their dirty plates, and wash every single dish before driving home in the dark, utterly exhausted. Today, I was completely rewriting the old painful script. I did not wake up early. I slept in until 9 o'clock in the morning. I drank my coffee incredibly slowly, reading the Sunday paper on my comfortable living room couch. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, I took a warm, relaxing shower and put on a nice, clean wool sweater. I did not wear an apron or comfortable, slip-resistant cooking shoes. I wore nice leather boots and a touch of light makeup. I looked like a guest rather than a desperate, overworked caterer. At exactly 45 minutes past 4, I got into my car. The autumn leaves were falling, covering the streets in bright shades of orange and red. I drove to a local small bakery, completely skipping the crowded, expensive grocery store. I walked inside, inhaling the sweet smell of sugar, and purchased a single pre-baked cherry pie. It cost me exactly $15. I carried the warm cardboard box out to my car, feeling a strange, nervous flutter in my stomach. The box felt incredibly light in my hands. It was completely foreign to me to arrive anywhere without a massive, heavy burden to carry. I pulled into my parents' long paved driveway at exactly 5 o'clock. I parked my small car right behind Mark and his massive leased luxury vehicle. I took a deep, steadying breath, gripping the cold steering wheel tightly. The 6 weeks of absolute silence were officially over. The silent treatment had completely failed to break me, and now I was walking directly into the belly of the beast. I picked up the small cardboard box and walked slowly up the front brick steps. I did not let myself in through the side kitchen door like a hired servant. I walked straight up to the heavy wooden front door. I lifted my hand and firmly pressed the glowing doorbell. I listened to the deep chimes echoing through the large house. I stood on the porch waiting patiently in the cold air. I heard heavy footsteps echoing in the front hallway. The door swung open, revealing my father. He was wearing his comfortable weekend clothes, but his face looked entirely confused. He stared at me, and then his eyes darted rapidly down to my completely empty hands save for the small bakery box. "Hello, Dad," I said gently, offering him a polite, quiet smile. "Sarah," he mumbled, stepping aside to let me into the large, brightly lit foyer. "You rang the doorbell." "You never ring the front doorbell. And you are incredibly late." "I am not late, Dad," I replied, stepping into the warm house. "Dinner is supposed to be served at 5 o'clock. I am here exactly on time." He closed the heavy door behind me, looking incredibly flustered. "But the food," he stammered, rubbing the back of his neck nervously. "Your mother has been looking out the window since 1 o'clock this afternoon. We thought you were just running behind at the store or stuck in bad traffic. We have not eaten anything all afternoon." "I brought dessert," I said simply, holding up the cherry pie so he could clearly see it. I took my warm coat off and hung it carefully in the hall closet. The air in the house felt incredibly strange. It lacked the familiar, heavy, comforting scent of roasting garlic and baking bread. The house smelled entirely empty and cold. I walked past my bewildered father and stepped directly into the large open kitchen. The countertops were perfectly clean and entirely bare. The large, expensive stainless steel oven was completely dark and cold. There were absolutely no pots boiling on the stove. There were no plates set on the large dining table. The beautiful kitchen was completely dead. My mother was sitting on a tall bar stool near the kitchen island. She was wearing a beautiful bright silk blouse, fully expecting a grand catered event. Emily and Mark were sitting at the breakfast nook, scrolling mindlessly on their expensive mobile phones, waiting to be served. When I walked into the room, all three of their heads snapped up instantly. The silence in the kitchen was absolute and deafening. They stared at me, taking in my nice clothes, my relaxed posture, and the small singular cardboard box resting in my hands. They looked at my empty arms as if they were trying to solve a highly complicated puzzle. Emily was the first one to finally speak. She dropped her phone onto the wooden table with a loud, sharp clatter.
"Sarah, what is going on?"
she demanded, her voice rising in immediate, palpable panic. "Where are all the grocery bags? Where is the Sunday roast? What are we supposed to eat tonight?" I walked calmly over to the counter and carefully placed the cherry pie on the smooth marble surface. "I do not know, Emily," I said, looking directly into her wide, panicked eyes. "What did you decide to cook for us tonight?" The heavy silence in the kitchen finally broke. It shattered into a million chaotic pieces. Emily stared at me, her mouth hanging completely open. Her face turned a bright, furious shade of red. "Me!" Emily shrieked, her voice bouncing loudly off the expensive tile backsplash. "Why would I cook Sarah?" "You are the one who always brings the Sunday dinner. It is your job. You always do it." "It is a family tradition," my mother added quickly, clutching the delicate collar of her expensive silk blouse. "Sarah, you have brought the fresh groceries and cooked the Sunday meal for 10 solid years. You cannot just walk in here completely empty-handed and expect us to feed you. We have absolutely nothing in the refrigerator. We are your aging parents, and you are acting completely incredibly selfish." "I am not your personal chef, Mom," I said, keeping my voice incredibly low and perfectly steady. "I am your daughter. I am a guest in this house exactly like Emily and Mark. If there is no food, then I suppose we will all be a little hungry tonight." My father stepped fully into the kitchen, his face flushed with sudden hot anger. "This is completely ridiculous!" he bellowed, waving his heavy hands wildly in the air. "We are a respectable, polite family. We do not bicker over groceries like absolute children. Sarah, you should have warned us that you were going to pull this incredibly petty, malicious stunt. You completely ruined our entire Sunday evening." I looked closely at the three of them. I saw the absolute terrifying depth of their daily entitlement. They were not worried about my feelings. They were not worried about why I was suddenly so exhausted. They were only worried about their empty stomachs and their massive personal inconvenience. The emotional friction was palpable, sparking dangerously in the cold, empty room. Mark suddenly pushed his chair back. The wooden legs scraped loudly against the highly polished kitchen floor. He stood up slowly, puffing his broad chest out, trying desperately to assert his absolute dominance over the chaotic room. He looked at me with a deep, incredibly familiar sneer. "Look!" Mark announced, his voice booming loudly across the granite island. "I am not going to let a silly, childish tantrum completely ruin a nice family evening. If Sarah wants to throw a massive pity party over a few missing groceries, she can do it all by herself. I am a highly successful businessman. I will easily handle this minor issue. I am going to order out and completely save the night." Emily looked up at her tall husband, her eyes filling with absolute adoring relief. "Oh, Mark, thank goodness," she sighed heavily, placing her hand delicately over her heart. "I am absolutely starving. Let us order from that amazing, highly exclusive Italian place downtown." Mark smiled smoothly, pulling his expensive leather wallet from his back pocket. "Done," he said confidently. He pulled his large smartphone from his pocket and quickly dialed the busy restaurant. We watched him pace around the kitchen island, heavily projecting the absolute image of a wealthy, highly generous provider. "Yes, I need to place a massive delivery order," Mark barked loudly into the phone, waving his hand dismissively in my general direction. "I need 4 large truffle pizzas, 3 orders of the expensive veal, and 4 massive house salads. Yes, the address is in the private gated community. I will pay right now directly over the phone." He opened his leather wallet. He easily bypassed his own personal debit card and his own maxed-out credit cards. He reached carefully into the very back slot. He pulled out a familiar, sleek silver piece of plastic. It was the emergency credit card that was legally connected entirely to my personal bank account. Emily must have quietly handed it to him weeks ago, hoping they could somehow bypass the tight freeze I had placed on it, or perhaps Mark foolishly assumed that I had quietly turned it back on after his incredibly aggressive, threatening voicemail. "Go ahead," Mark said loudly, reading the long string of numbers, perfectly spelling them out for the distant restaurant employee. He read the expiration date and the security code with absolute, completely unearned confidence. We stood together in the quiet kitchen, waiting patiently for the transaction to process. My mother smiled smugly at me, clearly thinking that Mark had completely outsmarted my little rebellion. Emily leaned heavily against the counter, looking completely, utterly vindicated. Mark tapped his expensive leather shoe gently against the tile floor. "Yes, I am still here," he said into the phone, his loud voice dropping a tiny fraction of an ounce in confidence. "What do you mean it declined?" The smug, happy smile instantly vanished from my mother and her face. Emily stood up incredibly straight, her wide eyes darting frantically toward her panicked husband. "Run it again," Mark demanded, his face suddenly flushing a deep, highly embarrassed shade of purple. "There is absolutely no way that specific card declined."
I have a massive credit limit. Run the numbers again. I will read them to you very slowly.
He read the 16 digits again, his deep voice trembling very slightly under the intense crushing pressure of our collective silent stares. The heavy silence in the kitchen stretched out, feeling incredibly long and highly uncomfortable.
Listen to me,
Mark suddenly shouted into the phone, completely losing his carefully crafted professional composure.
Your credit machine is obviously broken. I am a highly important client. You need to send the hot food right now, and I will pay your delivery driver in pure cash.
There was a very short, highly pathetic pause. Mark lowered the phone slowly, pulling it far away from his ear. The restaurant manager had simply hung up on him. Mark stood totally frozen in the exact center of the large kitchen. He was holding the silver credit card in his wildly trembling hand. He looked incredibly small and deeply, profoundly humiliated. His massive, highly successful facade was completely shattered right in front of his devoted wife and his highly demanding in-laws. I stood perfectly still, watching the absolute total destruction of his beautiful illusion.
"That is my card, Mark,"
I said, my voice completely calm, cutting through the thick, heavy silence like a sharp knife. "That is the emergency card connected entirely to my personal checking account. I told Emily 4 weeks ago that the account was permanently frozen. Why are you trying to use my hard-earned money to play the big, generous provider?" The cold air in the room suddenly felt incredibly thin. The painful, absolute truth was finally laid bare on the kitchen island right next to the $15 cherry pie. My father looked directly at Mark. His aging eyes narrowed, filling quickly with deep, sudden confusion. "Mark," my father asked slowly, taking a hesitant step forward, "why are you using Sarah and her credit card to buy our family dinner? You told me last week that your new real estate deal just closed for $500,000. Mark swallowed hard, his large throat bobbing nervously. He looked completely trapped, exactly like a small animal caught securely in a sharp snare. He tried desperately to formulate a clever, believable lie, but the absolute shock of the public denial had completely short-circuited his entire brain.
"It is just a temporary minor banking mix-up,"
Mark stammered loudly, frantically, shoving the silver card back into his deep leather wallet. "My large funds are entirely tied up in an overseas escrow account. I just borrowed the card today because it was incredibly convenient." "It is not convenient," I corrected him gently, but with absolute total firmness. "It is completely fraudulent." Emily burst into sudden, incredibly dramatic tears. She buried her bright red face in her hands, sobbing loudly into the quiet kitchen. "You completely humiliated him, Sarah," Emily cried, pointing a violently shaking finger directly at my chest. "You planned this entire awful thing. You came here tonight just to embarrass my amazing husband in front of our poor parents." My mother rushed quickly to Emily, wrapping her thin arms protectively around her crying, hysterical daughter. "How could you be so incredibly cruel?" My mother hissed at me, her dark eyes flashing with pure, highly misdirected hatred. "You are an absolutely terrible, totally ungrateful daughter. After everything we have constantly done for you, you come into our peaceful home and you treat us like absolute garbage." The heavy, incredibly painful accusations began to fly across the large room, moving fast and incredibly sharp. They were desperate, deeply terrified people frantically throwing heavy stones, hoping to distract everyone from their own massive, towering failures. The absolute breaking point had officially arrived. The kitchen felt incredibly small despite its massive size. The air was thick, heavy with their projected anger and their deep, panicked embarrassment. Emily continued to sob loudly, burying her face into my mother and her silk blouse. Mark stood frozen in the corner, staring blankly at the tile floor, completely stripped of his usual arrogance. My mother glared at me, her eyes completely filled with a highly toxic mix of rage and total confusion. She had just called me cruel. She had just called me a completely ungrateful daughter. I did not yell. I did not raise my voice even a fraction of an inch. I did not match their chaotic, frantic energy. I simply stood there in my nice wool sweater and I looked at the three of them. A deep, incredibly profound sadness washed over me. It was not a sadness for myself, but a profound sadness for the beautiful, entirely fake illusion that we had all worshipped for a decade. "What exactly, Mom?" I asked softly, my voice completely clear and perfectly steady in the quiet room. "What exactly have you done for me in the last 10 years? My mother opened her mouth ready to fire back a quick defensive response, but the words completely failed to materialize. She looked at my father, desperately searching for a lifeline, but my father was staring down at his aging hands, completely unable to meet my gaze. "Let me tell you exactly what I have done for you." I continued, taking a slow, very deliberate step forward. "I have spent the last 10 years working 60 hours a week from a tiny, cramped desk. I took on a heavy, highly exhausting second job, working late into the night, specifically so you and Dad could afford to keep this massive house. I paid your incredibly high property taxes. I paid your expensive premium cable bills. I paid for the luxury car sitting right now in your heated garage." I paused, letting the heavy, undeniable truth settle directly onto their shoulders. I watched my mother slowly drop her arms, stepping slightly away from her sobbing daughter. "I have not taken a single relaxing vacation since I was 32 years old." I said, my voice wavering just a little bit as the painful memories bubbled to the surface. "I canceled my own planned trip to Europe 5 years ago. I lost my entire non-refundable deposit because Mark came to my house crying on my sofa. He begged me for $30,000 to save his completely failed business. I gave him my entire life savings to protect Emily and the children from public bankruptcy. He completely swore that he would pay me back. He never gave me a single dime." Emily stopped crying instantly. She pulled her head up, wiping her stained cheeks, looking incredibly confused. She turned her head slowly, looking directly at her husband. "Mark," Emily whispered, her voice completely hoarse. "What is she talking about? You told me your new investors completely covered that bad quarter." Mark did not look at her. He stared intently at the expensive stainless steel refrigerator, looking completely sick to his stomach. "There were no investors." "Emily," I said gently, feeling a sudden heavy wave of pity for my deeply foolish sister. "I was the investor. I have always been the only investor. I paid for your children and their expensive sports leagues. I paid the minimum balances on your secret shopping credit cards. I completely funded your beautiful, highly curated life. And I did it all willingly because I desperately wanted you to simply love me." The heavy kitchen was absolutely silent. The only sound was the quiet, rhythmic ticking of the large grandfather clock in the distant hallway. They were completely, utterly speechless. The massive, towering wall of denial was finally crumbling down brick by heavy brick. I thought if I was completely indispensable, I would finally be valuable. I confessed, laying my deepest, most vulnerable truth completely bare on the cold marble island. I thought if I solved every single problem and paid every single bill, you would eventually look at me and see a daughter or a sister worth inviting to the main table. But you never did. I looked directly at my mother. I remembered the heavy, exhausting anniversary party. I remembered the endless, thankless labor. "You threw a massive, highly expensive party in my own backyard," I said, my voice dropping to a quiet, heartbreaking whisper. "I paid for the expensive catering. I cleaned the yard. I stood on my aching feet for 12 solid hours, making sure your wealthy friends had full glasses of champagne. And when it was time to sit down, Emily placed me at the far end of the yard with the toddlers. And you, Mom, you did not say a single solitary word to defend me. You let me sit there completely invisible in my own home. A single hot tear slipped quietly down my cheek. I did not bother to wipe it away. I let it fall. I was finally done hiding behind a polite, accommodating smile. I was so incredibly tired, Mom, I said, breathing out a long, heavy sigh. I was exhausted from carrying the absolute weight of 4 healthy adults on my single breaking back. I was completely drained financially and emotionally. And the most heartbreaking part of this entire decade was realizing a deeply painful truth. I looked at all of them, making sure my clear eyes met theirs. You did not love me, I said softly, the absolute finality of the statement ringing loudly in the empty room. You loved my money. You loved my quiet, endless convenience. You loved the comfortable, luxurious life that my silent exhaustion completely afforded you. But you did not actually love me. 3 quiet days passed after the disastrous Sunday dinner. It was Wednesday evening. The autumn air was crisp and completely clear. I was sitting on my back porch, wrapped tightly in a thick, comfortable blanket. I was drinking a cup of hot herbal tea, watching the wind rustle the dry leaves in the dark yard. The sound of car tires crunching slowly on my graveled driveway broke the heavy silence. I did not move. I waited patiently, listening to a car door open and close. Heavy, incredibly familiar footsteps walked slowly around the side of my small house. My father, David, stepped into the dim light of the patio bulb. He was completely alone. He did not look like the proud, highly demanding patriarch who had yelled at me in his large kitchen. He looked incredibly small and deeply, profoundly exhausted. He was wearing an old, faded cardigan instead of his usual expensive golf attire. He stood near the edge of the wooden deck, holding his hands awkwardly in his deep pockets.
Hello, Sarah,
he said, his voice quiet and completely stripped of its usual booming authority. Hello, Dad, I replied softly, gesturing calmly to the empty wicker chair sitting directly across from me. He walked over slowly and sat down with a heavy, incredibly painful sigh. He rubbed his aging face with his rough, tired hands. We sat in total silence for a very long time. The only sound was the cold wind blowing gently through the tall oak trees. I spent the last 3 days looking through our financial files, he finally said, staring down at the wooden deck. I had to create a digital portal with the electric company. I had to look at the actual property tax statements. I saw the massive towering balance on the premium cable account. He paused, letting out a long, shuddering breath.
I did not realize, Sarah,
he whispered, shaking his gray head slowly. I truly, honestly did not realize how incredibly expensive our daily lives had become. Your mother and I, we just assumed our monthly pension was easily covering the bulk of it. We completely ignored the truth because you made it so incredibly easy for us to look the exact other way. I took a slow sip of my hot tea, feeling the warmth spread deeply through my chest. Ignorance is a very comfortable choice, Dad, I said gently. But it was a choice that completely broke my tired back. He looked up at me, his aging eyes filled with a deep, crushing sorrow. I know, he said, his voice breaking slightly in the cold night air. You laid everything out on the kitchen island, and I felt so incredibly ashamed. When you told us about Mark and the $30,000, I felt physically sick to my empty stomach. I realized we had completely enabled a selfish monster while entirely ignoring our own beautiful daughter. We took the path of absolute least resistance. He continued, leaning forward heavily in his wicker chair. You were always so incredibly strong, Sarah. You were so capable and so quiet. Emily was loud and incredibly demanding. It was simply easier to give Emily what she wanted just to keep the peace and to silently rely on you to clean up the massive mess. We punished you entirely for your own competence. The sheer brutal honesty of his words felt like a soothing, warm balm on a very old, incredibly painful wound. He was not making empty excuses. He was not trying to shift the heavy blame onto Mark or Emily. He was simply owning his own massive failure. "It hurt, Dad," I whispered, letting my heavy guard down just a tiny fraction. It hurt so much to be completely invisible in my own family. "I am so incredibly sorry, Sarah," he said, reaching across the small patio table to gently touch my cold hand. "I am sorry that we took your quiet, endless love completely for granted. I am sorry that we treated your massive generosity like a simple expected obligation. I completely failed you as a father. A father is supposed to protect his daughter, and instead, I let you carry my heavy burdens for an entire decade." A hot, silent tear slipped down my cheek. I did not pull my hand away. I let his rough, warm fingers hold tightly onto mine. "We are going to sell the big house," he announced quietly, the massive decision hanging heavy in the crisp autumn air. "It is entirely too big for us, and we simply cannot afford the daily upkeep without your silent checks. We are going to find a small, comfortable condo much closer to the city. We are going to live strictly within our own financial means." I looked at him, feeling a sudden deep wave of genuine respect for the aging man sitting across from me. It was a massive, incredibly painful step down for his proud, carefully curated social image, but it was the only truly honest path forward. "I think that is a very smart decision, Dad," I said softly, squeezing his hand gently in return. "It will not be easy," he admitted, offering me a sad, incredibly tired smile. "Your mother is currently furious, and Emily is completely refusing to speak to us because we absolutely will not offer Mark a bailout loan. The entire family is a chaotic, massive mess right now." "It is a necessary mess," I replied, wrapping my thick blanket tighter around my shoulders. "You cannot heal a broken bone without resetting it first. The immediate pain is just absolute proof that the healing process has finally started." He nodded slowly, deeply understanding the undeniable truth of my spoken words. He stayed on the back porch for another entire hour. We did not talk about money or overdue bills or Mark and his terrible lies. We just talked simply like a father and a daughter. We watched the bright stars slowly appear in the dark night sky. The heavy, toxic defensiveness was completely gone, entirely replaced by a quiet, incredibly fragile foundation of mutual, honest respect. 2 days later, on a cold Friday afternoon, my heavy wooden front door vibrated with a quiet, hesitant knock. I walked slowly down the short hallway and I pulled the heavy door open. Emily was standing on my small concrete porch. She looked completely unrecognizable. She was not wearing her usual, incredibly expensive designer clothes. She was wearing plain gray sweatpants and a faded, highly worn college sweatshirt. Her blonde hair was not perfectly curled. It was tied back in a very messy, tangled knot. Her bright blue eyes were heavily bloodshot and completely swollen from days of constant heavy crying. "Can I please come inside?" Emily asked, her voice cracking, completely devoid of its usual sharp arrogance. "Of course," I replied, stepping back and opening the door wider, silently allowing my younger sister to enter my quiet home. We walked into the small living room. I pointed to the comfortable sofa, and she sat down incredibly slowly, as if her entire body was made of fragile, broken glass. I sat in the armchair directly across from her, folding my hands carefully in my lap. We sat in heavy, incredibly uncomfortable silence for several long minutes. I did not rush her. I let the quiet air settle firmly between us. Mark left this morning. Emily finally whispered, staring blindly at the wooden coffee table. He packed a large suitcase, and he drove away in his leased luxury car. He said he needed some space to figure out his complicated financial portfolio. But I know the absolute truth, Sarah. He is running away because the massive, towering pile of lies finally collapsed. I am so incredibly sorry, Emily, I said softly, feeling a genuine deep ache for my sister and her completely shattered life. Do not be sorry, Emily replied, letting out a harsh, incredibly bitter laugh. You tried to quietly protect me for 5 long years. You gave him $30,000 to save our family, and I stood in Mom and Dad and their large kitchen and I completely screamed at you, calling you entirely selfish. I was so incredibly blind, Sarah. She leaned forward, burying her face in her trembling hands. I was not just blind. She sobbed loudly, the heavy tears falling onto her faded sweatshirt. I was deeply, incredibly jealous of you. I frowned, leaning slightly forward in my comfortable armchair. Jealous of me? I asked, feeling entirely confused by her sudden, highly unexpected confession. Emily, you had the massive house, the beautiful children, and the completely perfect wealthy social circle. Why would you ever be jealous of my quiet, incredibly small life? Because your life is actually real, Emily said, lifting her tear-stained face to look directly into my eyes. You completely built it with your own 2 hands. You do not need a loud, arrogant man to constantly validate your exact worth. You do not need expensive, heavily branded clothing to make you feel important. You are entirely, completely free, Sarah. She wiped her wet nose, taking a long, highly shuddering breath. I felt completely trapped for my entire adult life, Emily confessed, her voice dropping to a vulnerable, incredibly raw whisper. I married a man who only cared about his public, highly curated image. I was constantly terrified that everyone would eventually discover that we were entirely broke and living a complete massive lie. So I completely overcompensated. I demanded expensive things because they were the only things that made me feel slightly valuable. She looked around my small, incredibly cozy living room. And I put you down constantly, Emily said, fresh tears rolling down her pale cheeks. I completely mocked your small house and your quiet life because making you feel incredibly small was the only way I could briefly feel big. I treated you like a hired servant because you were the only person strong enough to actually carry my heavy, massive burdens. I used you, Sarah, and I am so incredibly sorry. The heavy, incredibly painful confession hung completely still in the quiet afternoon air. It was the absolute raw truth, completely stripped of all its toxic defensive armor. I looked at my younger sister. I saw the deeply insecure, entirely terrified little girl hiding just beneath the expensive, highly broken surface. The deep, heavy resentment that I had carried for a decade slowly began to dissolve, leaving behind a profound, highly aching sense of mutual loss. We both made terrible, incredibly destructive mistakes, Emily, I said gently, leaning forward to look deeply into her tired eyes. You did not make any mistakes, Emily argued weakly, shaking her messy head. You were completely perfect. You paid for absolutely everything. That was my exact mistake, I replied, my voice completely clear and incredibly honest. I bought your love instead of demanding your absolute respect. I completely enabled Mark and his massive, terrible lies because I was absolutely terrified of conflict. I thought if I just kept writing the heavy checks, you would eventually see my worth. I took away your personal consequence, and by doing that, I completely took away your ability to actually grow up. Emily let out a soft, highly understanding gasp. She finally saw the incredibly toxic, completely codependent cycle that had firmly trapped us both for 10 long years. We were a completely broken team. I continued offering her a very small, incredibly sad smile. You demanded the impossible illusion, and I quietly, entirely funded it. But the beautiful illusion is completely gone now. We are just two adult sisters sitting in a small, quiet house. Emily nodded slowly, wiping her eyes with the long sleeve of her faded sweatshirt. What do we do now? She asked softly, sounding entirely lost and incredibly vulnerable. We start completely over, I said simply, the absolute truth ringing loudly in the quiet room. We start entirely from scratch. I stood up slowly from the comfortable armchair. I walked into the small kitchen and poured a fresh cup of hot chamomile tea. I carried the warm mug back into the living room. I placed it gently on the wooden coffee table right in front of my sister. Emily wrapped her shaking hands entirely around the warm ceramic. She took a slow, highly hesitant sip, letting the hot liquid soothe her raw, completely exhausted throat. What does starting completely over actually look like? Emily asked, looking up at me over the rim of the mug. She sounded exactly like a frightened child asking for directions in a very dark, incredibly unfamiliar forest. It looks like absolute, completely uncomfortable honesty, I said, sitting back down in my chair. We have to lay down entirely new rules, Emily, and the very first rule is completely non-negotiable. Emily swallowed hard, her blue eyes wide and highly attentive. Okay, she whispered, nodding her head slowly. I will never write another check to cover your massive living expenses, I said, making sure my voice was completely clear and absolutely firm. The emergency credit card is permanently destroyed. I will not pay for the expensive private sports leagues or the luxury hair salons or your heavy mortgage payments. You and Mark are going to have to face the complete reality of your own financial choices. If you lose the big house, then you lose the big house. I will absolutely not step in to miraculously save the day. The harsh, undeniable reality of my words hung heavily in the quiet room. A month ago, Emily would have screamed and thrown a massive, highly dramatic tantrum. Today, she just stared at the dark tea resting inside her mug. I know Emily said, her voice completely devoid of its usual sharp fight. I am going to look for a job on Monday morning. I have not worked in a real office in 8 long years, but I have to figure it out. The children still need to eat, even if their father is completely running away from his massive debt. I felt a sudden deep surge of genuine pride for my younger sister. It was a very small, incredibly terrifying step, but it was a real step in the right direction. I am completely willing to help you polish your old resume, I offered gently, leaning forward to look directly into her eyes. I am willing to watch the children on a Saturday afternoon so you can go to a job interview. I am completely willing to be your sister and your friend, but I will never again be your personal bank account. Emily looked up, offering me a small, incredibly fragile smile. I think I need a sister much more than I need a bank account, she confessed quietly. I smiled back, feeling the heavy, toxic ice finally begin to melt. And there is a second rule. I continued, shifting my weight comfortably in the armchair. What is it? Emily asked, sitting up slightly straighter on the comfortable sofa. The emotional labor has to be completely, entirely shared, I said, stating the boundary with absolute, undeniable clarity. When we eventually have family dinners again, I will not do the entire grocery shopping. I will bring a single dish, or I will bring absolutely nothing. I will sit at the main table right next to you. I will not be the invisible host standing in the hot kitchen. I will be a respected guest exactly like everyone else. I completely understand, Emily said, nodding her head with genuine, absolute conviction. You are not the hired help, Sarah. You are the host when we are in your home, and you are our equal anywhere else. And I added softly, letting my voice drop to a gentle, highly vulnerable register. I need you to ask me about my own life. For 10 years, every single conversation we ever had revolved entirely around your marriage, your children, and your massive problems. I need you to completely care about my day. I need you to ask me how I am doing, and I need you to actually listen to my honest answer. Emily let out a sharp, highly painful gasp. She realized in that exact crystal clear moment how incredibly deeply she had neglected our entire relationship. She reached across the small coffee table and she grabbed my hands, holding them tightly in her own. I promise, Sarah, Emily whispered, fresh tears welling up in her bright blue eyes. I completely, absolutely promise. I want to know everything about your life. I want to know what books you are reading and what you are doing at work. I want to be a real, actual sister to you. We sat there in the quiet living room holding tightly onto each other. It was not a magical, instantaneous fix. The massive, towering damage of a deeply dysfunctional decade could not be completely erased in a single afternoon. We both knew there would be incredibly difficult days ahead. Emily was going to face a terrifying, highly stressful financial reality. My parents were going to have to pack up their massive, beautiful home and move into a much smaller, highly humbling space. There would be deep moments of intense frustration and very old habits desperately trying to creep back into the light. But as I looked at my sister sitting on my comfortable sofa in her faded sweatpants, I finally felt a profound, incredibly beautiful sense of hope. The heavy, suffocating burden of the invisible expectations was completely lifted from my tired shoulders. We had successfully burned the old, incredibly toxic house straight down to the absolute ground, and now standing completely together in the quiet ashes, we could finally start to build something real. 6 months passed, bringing the warm, gentle breezes of early spring. The heavy, dark winter was finally over. It was a Saturday evening. I drove my small car across the busy city. I did not pull into a massive paved driveway in an exclusive, highly gated community. I parked on a narrow, highly crowded street right in front of a modest brick apartment building. Emily and her family lived on the 3rd floor. I walked up the 3 flights of stairs carrying a single medium-sized ceramic bowl. It was filled with a simple, fresh green salad. I did not bring a massive roast. I did not bring expensive imported cheeses. I brought lettuce and tomatoes and a homemade vinaigrette. I knocked on the painted wooden door. It swung open, revealing Mark. He looked completely different. He was not wearing a crisp, incredibly expensive polo shirt or a flashy luxury watch. He was wearing a plain white t-shirt and a faded pair of denim jeans. He held a wet dish towel in his right hand. When Mark ran away 6 months ago, he did not get very far. The harsh, incredibly crushing reality of his massive debts completely shattered his inflated ego. He hit absolute rock bottom, sleeping on his brother and his uncomfortable couch for 2 incredibly long months. He finally came back to Emily completely broken and genuinely deeply humbled. He currently worked as a shift manager at a local hardware store. It was not a glamorous, highly impressive title, but it paid an honest, steady wage. Hello, Sarah, Mark said, offering me a small, incredibly genuine smile. Come on in. The apartment is a little messy, but dinner is almost ready. Hello, Mark, I replied, stepping into the small, slightly cramped hallway. It smells absolutely wonderful in here. I walked into the small living room. The massive, incredibly expensive furniture from their old house was completely gone. They had sold it all to rapidly pay off their highest interest credit cards. The room was filled with simple, highly practical pieces. The twin boys were sitting on a colorful woven rug, quietly playing with a set of wooden building blocks. My parents were sitting on the modest, incredibly comfortable sofa. They looked older, but they also looked incredibly relaxed. They had successfully sold their sprawling, massive estate. They currently lived in a small, comfortable, highly affordable condominium located just 10 minutes away from my own house. My father was not wearing his country club attire. He was wearing a simple flannel shirt. My mother was completely devoid of her heavy, expensive jewelry. Sarah, my mother, called out, offering me a bright, incredibly warm smile. "Come sit down right next to me." I walked over and sat down on the completely normal sofa. I did not immediately rush into the kitchen to start washing dirty pots. I simply sat down and I asked my father about his small new balcony garden. We talked quietly, entirely like normal, highly relaxed people. Emily walked out of the incredibly small kitchen. She was wearing a simple cotton apron heavily stained with bright red tomato sauce. She looked completely exhausted, but her bright blue eyes were absolutely shining with genuine pride. "Dinner is ready," Emily announced, wiping her forehead with the back of her hand. We made a big pot of spaghetti, and Mark completely baked the garlic bread entirely from scratch. We did not sit at a massive, highly polished, formal dining table. We crowded around a small, circular wooden table tucked tightly into the corner of the small living room. Mark carried the heavy pot of pasta completely by himself. He served his children, and then he offered the large serving spoon directly to me. "Thank you, Mark," I said softly, taking the spoon from his rough, calloused hands. The dinner was incredibly messy. The boys dropped long, slippery noodles onto the clean wooden floor. The garlic bread was slightly burnt around the crisp edges. We drank cheap, incredibly simple red wine from mismatched, heavily scratched water glasses. But it was the absolute best meal I had eaten in 10 long years. The conversation did not revolve around expensive luxury cars or exclusive country club memberships. My father talked about his new, highly entertaining neighbors. Emily talked enthusiastically about her new job as a receptionist at a busy dental office. She complained about her sore feet, but she smiled widely when she talked about earning her very own paycheck. And then right in the middle of the noisy, incredibly chaotic meal, Emily turned her head and looked directly at me. "Sarah Emily," said, her voice completely clear, rising above the loud chatter of the young children. "How was your important meeting with the new corporate client on Thursday afternoon?" The entire table grew completely quiet. My mother leaned forward, looking highly interested. My father smiled, waiting patiently for my answer. Mark completely stopped eating, giving me his full, absolute attention. It was not a fake, highly forced question. It was a genuine, deeply caring inquiry. They actually wanted to know about my day. They actually wanted to hear about my quiet, incredibly independent life. "The meeting went incredibly well," I said, feeling a warm, bright light completely filling my chest. "I signed the new contract, and I am officially expanding my small bookkeeping business next month." "That is absolutely fantastic, Sarah," my father beamed, raising his mismatched water glass in a highly spontaneous toast. To Sarah and her massive success. We all clapped our glasses together, the thick glass making a dull, incredibly comforting clinking sound. I looked around the small, cramped table. The heavy, invisible burden that I had carried for an entire decade was completely gone. I was not the hired help. I was not the silent, invisible bank account. I was a respected, completely loved sister and daughter. The family dynamic was far from perfect. It was incredibly messy, highly complicated, and totally a work in progress. But for the very first time, the heavy burden of the evening was entirely shared. We were finally pulling the heavy wagon completely together. After the spaghetti dinner, the small apartment settled into a comfortable, incredibly quiet rhythm. I did not stand up to instantly clear the dirty plates. I did not rush frantically into the kitchen to start scrubbing the heavy, greasy pots. Instead, Mark and my father stood completely side by side at the small kitchen sink. They were talking quietly about the local professional baseball team. Mark had his white sleeves rolled up, washing the ceramic dishes with warm, soapy water. My father was drying them slowly with a clean, faded cotton towel. Emily was in the back bedroom reading a long bedtime story to the tired, completely full twins. My mother was sitting right next to me on the modest, practical sofa. She was knitting a small, soft blue blanket, the wooden needles clicking softly together. It was a completely ordinary, incredibly mundane weekend evening, but to me, sitting in that small room, it felt like a massive, incredibly beautiful miracle. I leaned my head back against the soft sofa cushions. I watched the warm, bright yellow light spilling freely from the kitchen doorway. I listened closely to the gentle, steady hum of my family simply existing. I did not feel the familiar, incredibly heavy urge to nervously manage the entire room. I did not feel the crushing, terrible anxiety of an impending massive financial crisis. The air was completely clear, completely devoid of the toxic, unspoken expectations that used to choke me. For 10 incredibly long years, I had believed a very toxic, highly dangerous lie. I believed that familial love was a strict financial transaction. I genuinely thought I had to constantly heavily buy my seat at the family dinner table. I thought my absolute only real value was firmly located in my open checkbook and my endless quiet labor. I looked down at my own hands resting quietly in my lap. They were no longer clenched tightly in constant heavy fear. They were completely, entirely relaxed. The long journey from the stressful backyard barbecue to this small, warm apartment was incredibly painful. It was a path paved with loud shouting, bitter tears, and weeks of terrifying total isolation. There were dark nights when I cried entirely alone in my small, quiet house. There were weak moments when I desperately wanted to simply give in just to stop the loud, angry shouting and the painful accusations. But I firmly held my ground. I completely refused to be their invisible, heavily abused savior anymore. And by bravely stepping back, I finally gave them the incredible life-changing gift of their own personal consequences. Mark learned how to be a real honest father and a genuine hard-working provider. Emily learned how to stand strongly on her own 2 feet, realizing her own massive potential. My parents learned how to live simply and deeply, appreciate the quiet, inexpensive moments of absolute peace. And I learned the most important, profound lesson of all. I learned how to finally completely love myself. Emily walked slowly back into the living room, tiptoeing softly across the woven rug. "The boys are fast asleep," she whispered, sitting down carefully in a small fabric armchair. She looked incredibly tired, but her pale face was completely peaceful and completely relaxed. "Would you like another glass of red wine, Sarah?" she asked, pointing gently to the open bottle resting on the small wooden table. "No, thank you, Emily," I said softly, offering her a warm, truly genuine smile. "I should probably head home soon. I have a very early morning tomorrow. I am going to a local outdoor farmer's market just to walk around and enjoy the bright morning sun." "That sounds absolutely lovely," my mother said, looking up slowly from her blue knitting. "Maybe I can join you next weekend, Sarah, if you do not mind the quiet company." "I would really love that, Mom." I replied, feeling a bright, warm spark of genuine joy completely fill my chest. I stood up slowly, grabbing my light waterproof jacket from the back of the practical sofa. Mark dried his wet hands and walked out of the small kitchen specifically to say goodbye. My father put down the dish towel and gave me a warm, incredibly tight hug. "Drive safely, Sarah," my father said, his voice full of real, honest affection. "I will, Dad, I promised." Emily walked me all the way to the front door, leaning in to gently kiss my cheek. "Thank you for coming tonight, Sarah," she whispered gently, her blue eyes shining with absolute pure sincerity. "Thank you for the delicious dinner," I replied, squeezing her hand tightly. I walked down the 3 long flights of stairs, feeling incredibly, completely light. The heavy, invisible bricks that I used to carry in my backpack were completely gone. I stepped out into the cool, dark city street. I took a massive, deep breath of the crisp spring air. I unlocked my small, highly reliable car and slid comfortably into the driver's seat. I turned the key, listening to the engine hum quietly. I looked up through my windshield at the 3rd-floor window of the brick apartment building. I saw the warm yellow light shining bravely in the dark, vast night. I saw the faint silhouettes of my family moving around the small living room. They were completely fine. They were surviving, and they were finally growing. I smiled a wide, incredibly genuine smile, putting the car slowly into gear. I drove through the quiet, mostly empty city streets, heading directly toward my own incredibly peaceful home. The heavy, utterly exhausting saga was officially over. The quiet, beautiful new normal had completely, fully begun. The massive ripples from my single quiet choice had completely reshaped our entire world. I was no longer the tragic, completely invisible martyr. I was no longer the human bank account. I was just Sarah. And for the very first time in my entire 42 years of life, being just Sarah was absolutely, completely enough. True family value is not measured by the financial burdens we silently carry for others, but by the mutual respect we demand and share. Setting boundaries is not an act of abandonment. It is a courageous act of love that forces everyone to grow, heal, and stand together.